What is a buyer panel, and how can you discover who the people are who influence your target customers' buying decisions? Welcome everybody, my name is Dale Richards, CEO of App Creative. We're an app development company on the Silicon Slopes of Utah, and we love building software that changes the world. If you want to create apps, scale your technology, transform your business, and disrupt the market, start now by subscribing and hitting the bell. Today, we're interviewing industry expert Matthew Taylor to talk about one aspect of the SaaS go-to-market strategy, which is the buyer panel. A buyer panel is a group of stakeholders or people who influence the buying decision in a company. A buyer panel often includes three distinct roles: the end user, that's the person who ultimately will use your product; the technical buyer, that's the person who will maintain and support your product within the customer's organization; and the economic buyer, and that's the person who actually approves the transaction. In olden days, we would say that's the person who cuts the check. Some things to listen for in Matthew's interview. Once you have the attention of a potential customer, how can you discover all the members of the buying panel? What kind of questions can you ask to learn about what obstacles you may face when selling to that customer? And how can you engage with a customer to be included in their buying process? Matthew has an extensive career in healthcare technology, working for companies like NextGen Healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Catholic Health Initiatives, and Kaiser Permanente. Matthew, thank you for joining me. I want to kind of give the listeners an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you. Tell us about yourself and about kind of your career up to this point. And then I want to talk a little bit about the buyer panel and the concept of the buyer panel. So let's start with you.
So yeah, thanks Dale. My name is Matthew Taylor. I'm a product executive. I've focused most of my career in the healthcare arena. So for me, most of my career so far has actually not been in product. I've been more in different types of healthcare organizations. So think provider groups consisting mostly of doctors, insurance plans, hospital groups, those kind of things. And only within the last few years have I transitioned into a product specific role. But that experience prior to sort of being on the buyer's side of the table has really, I think, helped me understand how to become a better product leader, because I just understand the different roles that people have and just how it's not typically just one person making the decision, which I think helped set up the conversation for today.
Your experience as a buyer is fascinating. I want to kind of start with asking, what is it about the buying process from the buyer's side that is broken or that is frustrating, especially when everyone's trying to sell you their SaaS products, they want to get your attention? What is it about the buyer's experience receiving the seller that's broken or may need fixing?
Lots of stuff. I mean, some of the big things that come to mind, especially in larger organizations, is just there's a lot of process that organizations use to try and create specific rules. So, out of fairness, so some will say, okay, if there's an expense going to be over a certain dollar amount, like $100,000 or over 3 years, then it's got to go through this process. So you might be the principal decision maker, being the one who says yes or no, we want to go with this product. But then there's almost like this internal lobbying that you have to do depending on that process to make sure, we have to get the CFO to sign off on it or somebody with the right process. So that's sometimes, I think, hard. And vendors, I don't necessarily that they appreciate or understand that complexity. And I think that's where sometimes they might be able to help in that process. And at least as a buyer for me, I've tried to loop them into that process of, selling me as a buyer is one step in that process. And then there's all this other stuff we have to do, whether it's security concerns from the CISO, whether it's, financial concerns in terms of what that's going to do to capital expenses, with finance. I mean, there's just all kinds of things. So I think having vendors be part of that process and actually help with that can actually be really advantageous.
So you would actually opt to let the vendors in on what the process looks like, how they can participate. It's not like this kind of veil of secrecy that you're trying to maintain.
I mean, that's been my strategy, because if you try and, hold back or not expose them to that, then they tend to just be pressuring you. And it's like, okay, well, I've already made my decision, so it doesn't do any good to sort of pressure me anymore. like here's where the other focus is and what has worked elsewhere. And especially for large organizations, sometimes they tend to look at, well, what have other large organizations done? So if, for example, I worked in the Blue Cross Blue Shield company, and so that's really an organization that's 27 different companies. So getting into one of the Blue Cross Blue Shield companies first is a huge challenge. But once you get into one, then you can say to another one that you're trying to sell to, well, hey, here's what we did in Texas. Texas approved it. Here's all the documentation they have. The barrier to get that next approval goes way down. And that's the same I've seen in other systems as well. It's like, oh, if this company trusts them, then, we'll lower our threshold or our concerns around, and, we'll be more apt to approve.
Tell me a little bit about this concept of the buyer panel. So all of the stakeholders that need to be influenced in order for the company to buy something. What did a typical buyer panel look like for you in your organizations?
Yeah, so again, for context, in my buyer panels, we've got a couple different roles. I'd say typically the ones I would sort of map out would be, there's somebody who's coming at it from, a clinical perspective. So that might be a physician. And then there's clinical team members, so not necessarily physicians. So it could be nurses, advanced practitioners, other people who have a clinical background, and those may have some of the same concerns that physicians do, but oftentimes they're very different. And so I think that's one of the things that people, they're like, oh, well, they're clinical, so they just care about this. It's like, they might share some of those things. And then there's really the administrative operations type person. So their role typically is, how do I make sure that the day-to-day of the clinic and the work that we're doing is flowing and working correctly? And then the last one is really the administrative or the finance piece. So typically we would have in different environments, that lens, from each of those four perspectives will be represented. And depending on the organization, they might have a stronger seat at the table. So in a provider group where it's mostly physician owned, physician led, the providers are probably going to be the one who have the strongest vote at the table. But if you flip that around and say go to an insurance organization like I talked about where it's Blue Cross Blue Shield, guess what? The finance folks are really going to have a strong seat. They're really going to want to hear about the ROI of what they're going to see, different metrics. So understanding, regardless of what industry that you're in, the different stakeholders and the constituents of the buyer panel, it's not just, hey, I got to focus on this user and get them to love using the product. They may not be the ones who are actually paying for it. It's helpful to have them use it, and that can work in your advantage because they can help advocate for you internally, but you've got to understand who really has a seat at the table and who's really going to be weighing in on those decisions, particularly from, a veto perspective.
You described the people that are on the panel in healthcare. I'm curious to know which of those would you consider to be like the end user versus like the economic buyer, so the person who has to approve the transaction. Also, who would be considered more of the technical buyer, so the person who's responsible to run, especially a technology product. Because you talked about the clinical people, you talked about the administrative people. Who is the end user, and who is the economic buyer and the technical buyer?
Yeah. I mean, in the healthcare setting, if you think about it in terms of your experience in the medical setting, you've probably got, many different sizes of groups. So you have, a large hospital system where they've got administrative staff and they have, IT staff that do things, they've got staff for really everything down to a small specialist that might be, one or two doctor practice and kind of everybody in between. So in the medical setting, the question you raised is a challenging one because you have to get a sense for, well, what is that? So like you said, there are technical aspects to it. So, when you think about trying to do some discovery in terms of technical feasibility, you have to have some idea of what it is that you're working with. And some practices, they're not big enough to really have any dedicated staff to be able to, focus on anything technical. They might know that they have that need and they might be outsourcing that completely. So you could be working with a third party, company who does that technical support. that you have to work with, on behalf of that practice. So, those are some of the dynamics in terms of the size of the group really sort of will inform often how rich their resources are in the different disciplines. So that's part of the challenge, I think, of selling into healthcare is it's different, or it can be very unique, to the practice in terms of what that looks like, but you still have to account for those different attributes.
What if I don't know? What if I don't know like who else is on the buyer panel? Let's say that I'm coming to you with a SaaS product and it's targeted to someone in the healthcare space. I know that's very broad, a very broad brush to paint with, but if I'm not even aware of who's on the buyer panel, how can I discover that from you? Or how can I invite you to share that information with me so that it's safe for us to talk about who else needs to be influenced, or who else needs to be, I mean, I probably wouldn't word it like that to you, but who else needs to be included in the discussion so that I can become more aware of the people who are going to influence my target customers' decisions?
Yeah, I think, one of the tactics that can be helpful is to, work backwards from prior experience. So you can take, maybe a good example or a bad example. It might be good to take a good one and say, okay, if you're talking to the buyer, say, okay, the last time that you did something similar in the organization, or that you saw this, what did that process look like? How did the implementation go? Who were the folks that were involved in, doing the work? Just getting curious about a previous experience. And oftentimes they're able to talk about it. And again, if you work your way backwards, it helps them think about a lot of the things that maybe didn't go well. Because if they talk about sort of the ideal happy path, they tend to forget those things. So that's a technique that works. And then you can talk about, okay, well, last time you implemented this, new HR system for you. Okay, well, who was involved with that? Who was impacted with that? Okay, this is going to be something different. Like we've talked about, this is going to be really more for people who are, doing this particular workflow, and that's different people. And so I think just getting really curious about a previous example can give you some tips and some ideas about other groups that might need to be involved.
So you're suggesting tapping basically the experience of that person by looking backwards, saying what happened last time, how did this play out, what were the problems? I think that's interesting. That's a very different question than just who else needs to weigh in on this decision, because it kind of forces that recall that the person, that your buyer may not even do on their own. Like you're kind of guiding them into doing almost a little sales retrospective on previous engagements. That's fascinating.
And it will help also with, particularly some of the gotchas. Like I've seen, some of the things which have really slowed down the buying process in the past have been a lot of concerns around security issues. And so different organizations will have a different posture. Sometimes that's, from the individual, themselves, whether they're the CISO or they're representing that security interest. Sometimes it's from the organization. And so I've seen a lot of groups, get pretty far through the buying process. And then there's some snag that comes up that feels like should have been surfaced, months prior, that they didn't do that. And so when you ask those kind of questions, I think it helps reveal some of those gotchas that maybe have happened before. And again, there's no trade secrets. It's not anything that can't be shared, but it's really helpful for you if you're trying to sell into an organization to understand where people got tripped up before.
Let's change directions here a little bit. So let's say that I'm exploring the buyer panel, and I've found that kind of my main end user really loves my product, and I'm talking to these end users. I mean, we could pick anyone on your panel, right? Let's say that we're targeting radiologists or whatever, right? And I've spoken to 100 radiologists, and they're like, yes, I love this. This software lets me do this and this and this, and they all love it. But like, people aren't buying. I'm going to the radiologist who's on board, but like I can't get the other stakeholders to participate. What's going on, and what can I do in a situation like that?
Yeah. So, always the first, I think, step for me is to get curious, right? Try and understand what that is. What does that radiologists, maybe relationship with the other practitioners. Sometimes you've got users who are, for example, they're always willing to try the latest thing. So any new thing that comes in, it's like, oh yeah, we want to try that. And so if that's that person, maybe that's not the right person yet to try and help represent you or trying to usher you into that organization, because they're willing to try everything. So you want somebody who's, willing to be daring and risk, but also have some credibility within the organization. Sometimes there's a mismatch between maybe just some of the actual financial elements involved in terms of, do you understand their fiscal year, what that looks like? Just their buying process, what's their thoughts around how they, choose to spend money. Some organizations, they have different approaches on investing in software. So you've got to make sure that how you're selling it lines up with that, and how, from a financial perspective, they treat capital versus operating expenses, what that can look like, because those can be meaningful. So whether you're offering a SaaS product or something that gets licensed, those things are all important. So just understanding the different financial aspects can be really helpful, and sometimes be an element that's keeping them from buying it, because it's more than just the user. There just could not be alignment from a financial perspective.
Yeah, in a previous interview, we talked with the other interviewee about value versus price. We talked about the need to create value. We talked about value creation versus value capture. And I guess my question to you is, let's start out with the yes or no question. Is it possible for your radiologist or your end user to be excited about your product without there really being any value created for the organization?
Yeah, I would say yeah.
I think what's dangerous about that, and just in my opinion, is that it could be kind of a false flag for the vendor, right? If you're a startup and you have a bunch of end users that are super excited about your product, and you think like, yes, I'm getting traction. and what's really happening is that they're just curious about everything, and you haven't really tapped into the value you're creating for that company yet. Right. And so that's like a huge step that needs to be looked at when you're trying to explore the buyer panel. How are we actually going to create value for the whole panel, not just for this one curious end user?
Yeah, so I think Rob Fitzpatrick, in sort of the mom test, I think he's got a number of different great questions that he asks there to try and that may help in that regard. I think another one that I've found in that regard that was, I'd say it's actually pretty recent, within the past year, that really helped was, get a sense for how excited somebody is about the product, and then kind of flip it around and ask the question and say, okay, let's imagine that you have this capability of this product and we were to take it away. How upset would you be if we took it away? And it's surprising. You wouldn't think it's a great question, but it's actually really revealing, and it reveals the value of what the alternative options are, where it's like, well, yeah, I really like it, but, relative to what that might mean for me in terms of switching my workflow or learning something new versus what I have today, you ask me if I like it, I really do. Asking me if I switch to something different, that's a completely different question.
Yep, that's a great question to explore substitutes. So if you're looking at like competitive forces, like what happens if I don't have this product? Well, I could just use a spreadsheet, or I could just use this other free tool and kind of like make up the difference in the pain that your product solves. And so I think it's really telling. Yeah, if you take that away, what are they going to do? Oh, well, they'll just go back to their previous life the way that it was before.
Well, and a really good example that people would see is, if you said, again, back to healthcare, but it's kind of a surprise if you ask people, what's the most popular form of way to communicate information, between doctors. You ask people what that would be. People might say, oh, the computer, they have this, and it's like, yes, and the fax machine is actually still well and alive. People are like, wait a minute, I've never even used a fax machine. It's like, well, go into any doctor's office, and I promise they have at least one, if not several, fax machines, because at the end of the day, that's the lowest common denominator for them, especially when you're working with small groups or so, that's an example to me where it's like, that's really easy to use. It's reliable. People really know it. And so, don't discount the fact that there might be things out there that might be low tech or really easy to use that you might actually be competing with that people don't even think about.
I like the notion of the lowest common denominator. So like maybe this organization is cutting edge, but they have to interface with other organizations who may not be where they are. And so you got to explore like what's really happening in their day to day, especially if, in that category where you're trying to compete. That's really, really interesting. Let me ask you this. You could build a product while you're doing all of this discovery that could be really expensive. And I like how you referenced Rob Fitzpatrick's book, The Mom Test, because he talks about that, about building the wrong product and then like losing all your money, How do you like iterate on a product while discovering the buyer panel? I don't know if anyone's really talking about that because those are two kind of complex parallel topics, right? Maybe this product needs to change, not because my end user doesn't like it, but because someone else in the buyer panel has some other demand for that product. How do I iterate on my product while discovering the buyer panel without developing anything?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best examples that I've seen, it's dated, but it's really good, is, I don't know if you've seen it, that it was like back in the day when they had nightly news, and it was like ABC did a special on IDEO. Did you ever see that video in terms of on the shopping cart and how they go through their process?
I am familiar with IDEO, but I don't know if I've seen the ABC piece on it.
If you just Googled IDEO shopping cart, you'll go back. It's like a 9-minute video. It's really cool because they kind of walk through the process. So this is a IDEA kind of design firm group. They're based in out west. I'm pretty sure they're connected somehow to Stanford. And so they have this really eclectic organization of all these different PhDs and doctors and all these things. And then basically just people come and bring ideas to them and say, hey, come up with an idea for whatever. So they just did this special with ABC and they said, well, go design a shopping cart. So they take all these people, regardless of their background, and they just go through their process, and you see them go through and what they do. So they go into different grocery stores of different sizes. They start talking to people. They talk to people, moms who've got, their kids loaded in the shopping cart, and people, all kinds of different people, and they're taking pictures and they're doing all this stuff. And they come back and they keep going back and forth between their makeshift office and the grocery stores with their different ideas. And so they do a lot of discovery and things with post-it notes and pictures, and they kind of hack together different versions of shopping carts that actually resemble a lot of what you and I would see today in terms of what's out there. And so I think, whether it's, channeling the preschooler in you in terms of getting out the arts and crafts, there's a lot of things you can do with paper. You don't have to worry about wireframes or, getting into different tool sets and say, well, let me build something that people can click through. You can really walk through examples with people and do some discovery and find out, if those things work. And it may feel like that's too big of a stretch, but there's some things that I think there's a lot of things you can tease out before you ever get to actually development that can be really helpful.
Yeah, Matthew Taylor, thank you so much. This has been great. I was really struck by Matthew's insight about asking the customer about similar purchases they made in the past and what obstacles arose. Like, what a gold mine of insight that you can use for your own sales process. If you want to learn more about other aspects of the go-to-market strategy, watch this video. Or if you want to watch the whole strategy series, watch this playlist right here.